much. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks especially to Kim and Marcy for suggesting and organizing the talk. I'm thrilled to be here. Today, I want to share an excerpt from my book, Stepford Daughters, Tools for Feminists in Contemporary Horror Films, which will be published in fall 2022 through Common Notions. The book comes out of my love for the genre and my interest in bridging the language of academia and the popular. Since 2012, I've been writing popular politicized pieces on culture, mostly concentrating on horror films. In 2015, with Madeline Lane McKinley and Kenan Sharp, I founded Blindfield Journal, whose goal was to find a public intellectual voice that was feminist, experimental, and radical. Personally, I think we are in a stage of history where we desperately need what Raymond Williams called an emergent structure of feeling that is leftist and feminist. As we are inundated with the language of austerity, capitalist realism, and moderation, cultural criticism can be the site for what the second wave feminists called consciousness raising. We need a common language to explain the transformations of the work world and everyday life, and to articulate our own opposition and hopes for a radically transformed horizon. In searching for that language, I find myself gravitating to Marxist feminist theories of social reproduction, which emphasize what Nancy Fraser calls the crisis of care, the ways that care work, service work, and emotional labor have become central to capitalism, but are at the same time disregarded and devalued. The advantages of social reproduction as a way to reevaluate capitalism are outlined succinctly by Salar Mohandesi and Emma Teitelman. As they put it, shifting our perspective from the point of production to that of social reproduction does not merely add to the narrative, it has the potential to transform that story. It allows us a far more nuanced approach to formation, one that focuses not simply on waged factory workers, but on the articulation of different kinds of struggles, those of the waged and unwaged, men and women, whites and non-whites, and citizens and immigrants. It allows us to deepen our understanding of the capitalist mode of production by showing how its rise was partly based on the manifold subsumption of socially reproductive activities under capitalist relations. In my book, I try to explain these theories in relation to contemporary horror films. The chapters focus on current visions of the family, paid service work, emotional labor, and coming-of-age experiences. As you will see in this theory, there is no way to separate feminism from capitalism, racialization, heterosexism, and other vectors of domination. In another recorded presentation, I've given more of an overview of my theories of how social reproduction relates to horror, which I'm happy to talk about in the discussion. But I thought I'd do something different today and focus on a chapter entitled Coming of Rage, Teens Entering the Futureless Future in Contemporary Horror. Thanks again so much for your engagement. The 2014 horror film It Follows opens in a seemingly placid, secure suburban neighborhood. All is quiet and peaceful. Birds chirp into the empty dawn streets. Suddenly, a teenage girl bursts out of a large, solid brick house. She's clearly terrified, running from something that no one else can see. An adult neighbor asks if she can help, but the young woman knows that her cause is hopeless. Baffled, her clueless father emerges from the house, asking how he can help. The answer is that he can't. In this world, adults have no answers, but their children must indulge their fantasies of being protectors. We will soon realize that Annie is being pursued by a slow, relentless force that plagues teen victims throughout the films. This shape-shifting monster, invisible to all except its target, never stops until it slaughters its prey or until its curse is sexually transmitted to another hapless teen. In the film's prelude, Annie decides to give up. Instead of running forever, she flees to a darkened beach and calls her parents to comfort them. By morning, all that is left is a horribly twisted and bloody corpse. And I forgot at the beginning to give a little trigger warning, but it is about horror, so the next slide is a little bit disturbing. Apologies. You can see it, right? Yeah. Unlike teen rom-coms that show young people conquering their fears and beginning adult lives, teens in contemporary horror films become corpses or killers. In this sense, today's coming-of-age horror films are contemporary realism, admitting that, due to dwindling access to their own social reproduction, The future for millennials and Zoomers is virtually futureless. The choices on offer are to bow down in front of the shrine of meritocracy and to spend the rest of one's life on a debt treadmill, or to refuse, and by doing so, become an outlaw, if not a monster. Young people no longer expect their lives to be better than that of their parents, and they are largely correct in this expectation. And as income inequality has grown, real wages and quality of life has diminished, making intergenerational mobility a dream deferred. The exciting creative jobs promised by the knowledge industry have failed to appear. Instead, youths are hit especially hard by precarity, feminization, and what Nancy Fraser calls a crisis of care. Generation Rent is faced with the choice of no job, or what David Graeber has called bullshit jobs. And with little to no social safety net, the alternatives seem bleak. Yet, young women especially are instructed that they should be grateful for the opportunities they now have. As they huddle over their ramen, they can spend hours scanning Instagram images of social influencers who suggest that empowerment and glamour is a limitless resource. Young women are pressed to be agentic, individualized, and entrepreneurial subjects, as Kim Allen argues. Those few who successfully lean in will be commodified and dangled in front of their age mates, who are told that the only reason they don't follow in the path of these successful peers is their negative attitude or lack of grit. In this, young women have become central figures in propagating the neoliberal dream of upward social mobility. Yet even the young people who make it will never cross the finish line. The likely future for even neoliberalism's winners is a life of downward mobility and debt peonage. However, even as capitalism gives back less to young people, it requires more. As capitalism speeds up, it demands, claims Malcolm Harris, a different kind of person, one whose abilities, skills, motions, and even sleep schedule are in sync with their role in the economy. More and more, young people are the objects of tough love, designed to contort them into a pleasing shape for their future roles. For their future roles as investments, productive machinery, human capital. The generation gap does not only point to fewer prospects and downward mobility for young people, it also features a freedom gap, with younger people increasingly pressured to micromanage their own identities and behaviors to fit the needs of capital. If they are born into middle-class families, this means that youth involves a battery of activities and training regimes preparing them for a hyper-competitive role. Youth from disadvantaged backgrounds will be managed in even more punitive ways. Their free time will be seen as a harbinger of criminal activity, and they are likely to enter the carceral system early. These are the kids I teach, and I see firsthand the tsunami of anxiety and pressures that they face. For these kids, the futureless future often seems foreordained by a past that includes homelessness, abuse, deportation, and hunger. Many of my students who are only 20 years old have already been to prison, have had their DACA status revoked, have full-time jobs, have kids, have had cancer due to the pollution in the Central Valley of California. Even young people who have more advantages are not given time to figure out who they are and what they want. Instead, they are intimately supervised from cradle to college. As Harris notes, this lack of control gives rise to an explosion of mental health problems and a lifetime of medication. And anxiety is only heightened by youth's total immersion in the feedback loop of social media, which amplifies bad feelings and insecurities. Yet this absent future, as a 2009 communique named it, also creates monsters, those who fight back. Monstrosity is in fact relative. When youths become monsters to those who demand their obedience and conformity, this resistance makes them beautiful in the eyes of their comrades. I am no longer young myself, but I recently experienced what could be called this twofold vision of monstrosity with some young comrades as we staged a women's strike event that included communal childcare, free food, and beautiful painted banners that expressed our vision of autonomous social reproduction and communal luxury. We were a peaceful and utopian collectivity, and yet we were treated as fearful interlopers to a permitted gathering and told by cops and signs to keep off the lawn of a public park where we hoped to conduct our mutual aid activities. In our eyes, we were a thing of beauty, but to those fearful of our unruly rebellion, we were the big bad, Antifa, terrorists, communists, anarchists, queers, monsters. This othering is the mainstay for our culture that gives way to moral panics about young people with dependable regularity. Occupy, women's strikes, Black Lives Matter, and anti-fascist movements have been propelled by youths, backed into the corner of a crisis capitalism and social depletion which eats its young. Many young people have recognized that their only options are to fight or die. Horror films have the capacity to do justice to these bleak yet galvanizing conditions. In horror, we are given permission to explore forbidden forms of violence, and that includes both the structural violence that young people face and the inner force that must be summoned to confront these conditions. The films I will address today explore the taboo dimensions of the coming-of-age tale, that is, emerging sexuality and refusal of heteronormative roles. Further, they connect these perennial themes of adolescent experience with the futurelessness offered by late capitalist adulthood. More, many of these narratives exemplify a trend towards what I'm calling riot horror, films that mobilize the figure of the young girl warrior as a model of insurgency and rebellion. So this is from a section. The chapter has like 5 different films I analyze, and this one is, I'll be looking at 2 today. One of them is It Follows. Now that we're old enough, where the hell do we go? In the 2012 book, The End of Men and the Rise of Women, Hannah Rosin made the case that our post-industrial moment has actually flipped the script, and that now women are thriving while men are falling behind. It is true that much labor has been feminized, and since many new jobs that are created are associated with traditionally feminine qualities, this provides women some new opportunities. Overall, though, feminized traits and activities are structurally devalued in our society, and most new service jobs reflect an overall disdain for the feminine, offering low wages, few benefits, and lack of security. More than that, with the reduction of state-sponsored social reproduction, such as welfare, unemployment, childcare, healthcare, food stamps, and education, much of the feminized work that people of all genders do to reproduce themselves is done for free, outside the work world, as people are made surplus by unemployment and confined to the wastelands of what Mike Davis called the planet of slums. Yes, post-industrialism comes with a few lucrative jobs in the fields such as communications and the creative industry, but for increasing numbers of men, women, genderqueer, and non-binary people alike, the future appears futureless. Of course, this is nothing new. For poor people and people of color especially, lack of opportunity has been a reliable staple of life for centuries. As more white people are slipping into the same cycles of poverty and hopelessness that have always plagued people of color, however, right-wing populism is seizing the opportunity to fan the flames of racism, capitalizing on the fear surrounding this rise in insecurity to generate feelings of what Jason Reed and others call negative solidarity amongst whites. That is, white people are embracing the very austerity measures that impoverish them in the hopes of reaffirming their status as a superior group of stoic bootstrappers, while banding together to keep foreign and racial others at bay, even at the expense of their own flourishing. We can't let this false narrative stand, and horror films can provide us with tools to tell a different story, one that builds solidarity against austerity and precarity, rather than erecting walls between us. In It Follows, we ourselves follow a young community college student, Jay, who sexually contracts a curse. The curse is a murderous force that follows its victim, taking different personified shapes as it relentlessly pursues its goal. We gather from the introduction of the film that Jay's life up until the point where she is cursed has been a kind of lower middle-class idyll, characterized by free time and downward mobility. She lives in a neighborhood that looks like it was once a prosperous suburb of Detroit, but is now filled with unkempt yards and crumbling homes. The setting is the first hint of the invisible racialized narrative that we will see throughout the film. The well-known tale of Detroit's deindustrialization is one of transition from a thriving center of production to a blighted place where people, especially African-American people, suffer abject poverty and are deprived of even the basic requirements of social reproduction. In It Follows, we see the disease of poverty spreading and following the children of those who participated in the white flight to the suburbs, abandoning and demonizing those they left behind, and even as they themselves can't escape the curse of futurelessness and precarity that has now transgressed racial boundaries. Jay spends her days with her younger sister and their friends, hanging out at their large but decrepit suburban home, while her single mother is out working at all hours. She entertains herself by dating and seems to be going through the usual stages of coming of age, admiring herself and preparing for sexual initiation in her still girly bedroom. A date with Jay's new boyfriend, Hugh, starts out well as they lightly banter while waiting in line for a movie, but ominous music and a vague sense of dissatisfaction permeate the scene. During a silly people-watching game, Hugh reveals that he longs to be a young child, hinting at how bleak the future looks to him. He tries to guess who Jay has picked from the crowd as a figure of envy, but when he points to a girl in a yellow dress and Jay can't see her, Hugh freaks out and insists that they leave before the movie starts. He drives her to a restaurant in his big, anachronistic American car, which evokes Detroit's past period of industrial thriving. On their next day, Hugh and Jay have sex for the first time. It seems as if this will initiate Jay into a new stage of maturity, as is typical in the coming-of-age tale. But instead, sex transports her into a nightmare, as she has now contracted a kind of sexually transmitted disease that can only end in horrific death. The sexual encounter that transmits it from Hugh to Jay is depicted ambiguously, filmed from a shadowy, neutral, distant point of view, allowing for multiple interpretations. Although Jay's innocently decorated bedroom and childlike features code her as virginal, we find out later that she is experienced and capable of thinking of sex as no big deal. It is not sex that defiles her, it is the bleakness of her surroundings and her future. After having sex with Hugh, she lies on her stomach in the back seat of his car. This is the last moment of her innocence. Hugh is about to tell her about it, and the terror will follow her from this moment on, won't allow her any further moments of introspection. Unaware that Hugh is preparing to knock her out and tie her up, she talks to herself, thoughtlessly twisting a half-dead blade of grass. It's funny. I used to daydream about being old enough to go out on dates and drive around with my friends in their cars. I had this image of myself holding hands with a really cute guy, listening to the radio, driving on some pretty road up north maybe, and the trees starting to change color. It was never about going anywhere anyway. It was just about the kind of freedom, I guess. Now that we're old enough, where the hell do we go? After this speech that reflects Jay's sense of futurelessness, Hugh chloroforms her, and she wakes up to find herself tied to a wheelchair in a spookily regreened abandoned car park. Here, Hugh introduces Jay to the rules of her curse. The force will follow you, no matter where you go. It takes different shapes, sometimes familiar forms, perhaps just to hurt you. Only you and others who have been previously cursed can see it. You must always make sure your location has more than one exit. You should pass it on as soon as you can by having sex with someone else. All of these rules seem cruel and terrifying, and they are. They are the individualized solutions we are given to social problems. The underlying message is, don't try to understand or eradicate this evil. Simply fend for yourself and pass it along. To prove to Jay that she is being followed, Hugh forces her to wait for it to appear. Eventually, a filthy, expressionless, naked young woman lumbers toward them. It is the first of the follower's many avatars. Many of these personifications of terror show the particularly gendered way Jay experiences her fear of a futureless future. They evoke prostitution, sexual assault, destitution, and homelessness. Later, another zombie-like young woman will follow her, wearing only one dirty athletic sock and showing her degradation by peeing on herself. These embodiments of the looming void that gapes before today's youth are often naked, existing in a world where the trappings of ambition and hope are stripped away. As Jay is learning about her doomed future, in a world away, we see her sister Kelly and their friends, Yara and Paul, playing cards on the girls' front porch. Even this state of so-called innocence, though, is haunted by death. Yara has been reading Dostoevsky's The Idiot on a strange, shell-shaped device that serves as a sort of Kindle. She reads a line out loud to her friends. I think that if one is faced with inevitable destruction, if a house is falling upon you, for instance, one must feel a great longing to sit down, close one's eyes, and wait, come what may. This inevitable destruction and feeling of hopeless passivity predicts the curse that Jay is facing, but in their innocent state, the group of teenagers connect it to their own enemy as drifting youth. We don't know much about their lives, but like many contemporary youths, they seem to be goalless and unmoored. Paul and Kelly work part-time at a yogurt shop, and other than that, they spend their days lolling around the house in a vague state of suspended animation that we can imagine will go on indefinitely. The crumbling house belongs to Jay and Kelly's single mom, who we see only in blurs and fragments. Her life also seems to be dominated by a low-wage job, but one that is more than full-time, as she supports her family alone and it has no actual time to spend with them. One of the many symbols of adult impotence in the film, she's not a monster, nor callous or cruel, but she is still powerless to help her kids because she must work endlessly to keep up even the husk of a previous form of middle-class domesticity, pointing again to a world where social supports are eroded to the point of non-existence. At several points, the girls decide not to disturb or tell their mother about the horrors they are undergoing because it would only worry her. She wakes up at 5:15. That would kill me, says Kelly, pointing to the mundane fears of the future that lie below the spectacle of it. Far from a symbol of cruel authority, the mother represents the teen's futurelessness, an absent presence of degraded feminized labor, no longer promising anything beyond minimal survival. The futureless future is one where even the right to basic maternal care work is forfeited. While the teens continue bantering on the porch, Hugh's car pulls up and he dumps the half-naked Jay in the street, shouting as he screeches off, "Don't let it touch you." Of course, at first, Jay doesn't believe that she is actually cursed. She and her family take Hugh's behavior as a twisted sexual assault. But rather than elicit sympathy from the neighbors, they point out the family's declining social status. Those people are such a mess, indicating the lack of solidarity among these suburbanites who will do anything to distance themselves from the encroaching futureless future. Where Jay was previously confident, this event erodes her self-image. We now see her looking in the mirror as a victim of sexual assault. She gingerly peeks in her panties, as if she doesn't know what she'll find there. Her body has become estranged. In a previous scene, she caught the neighborhood kids spying on her while she swam, but they seemed harmless. Now their ogling takes on a menacing cast. Where before she was in a state of innocence about the threats of sexual and economic violence that surrounded her, this trauma has forced her to become hyper-vigilant. She tries to go on with her life as usual, attending a community college class where her teacher reads to her from T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, a modernist poem concerning the fear of mortality. The poem, written by an upper-class white man, is often taken to be universal. And yes, of course, we all die. But the specificity of Jay's fear is indicated by her second sighting of it during the reading of the poem. Woodenly walking towards the window of her classroom, it has now taken the form of an elderly woman in a tattered hospital gown. Far from universal, this incarnation of mortality is a figure of neglected old age, the demonization and desexualization of older women as crones, and an eviscerated and anonymous healthcare system, again pointing to the futureless future that haunts contemporary girls, even in the blossom of their youth, so-called. When Jay asks, "Now that we're old enough, where the hell do we go?" we see that the wistful hope of adolescence is entangled with death and stagnancy in the late capitalist city. Charlie Line argues that the spatiality of the film is structured around 8 Mile Road, a boundary that bisects the city into rich and poor sectors, as a metaphor for another great divide, that between childhood and adulthood, he says. But I would reverse this claim and say that the boundary between childhood and adulthood is the metaphor, and what it signifies is the spreading stain of exploitation in the late capitalist city. Post-60s Detroit saw deindustrialization, joblessness, and white flight to the suburbs. As whites abandoned the city, it became the home for the dispossessed, those marginalized by the housing market, in greater peril of unemployment, most subject to the vagaries of a troubled economy. African Americans experienced advanced marginality, where whole populations were condemned to decaying, unsafe ruins, devoid of services or opportunity. As John Kramer clarifies, white domination and the successful reproduction of white communities was dependent on the coercive and controlled social reproduction of Black, brown, and immigrant communities. He details how white communities drained the capacity for social reproduction in the city by appropriating and hoarding the resources needed to build urban infrastructure. But this horror of abandonment will return to haunt the suburbs. White suburbanites demonize Black city dwellers to shore themselves up against this fate of permanent marginalization. But the real monster they face is their own complicity in generalized decay. Like the suburbs in Poltergeist and many other horror films built on native graveyards, the suburbs of Detroit are built on the graveyard of Black opportunity, standing as monuments to structural spatial racism. From the 60s to the present, attempts by African Americans to transgress Detroit's racial boundaries were met with unfeeling resistance as racist neighborhood groups loudly shouted down every hope for decent housing and civil rights. Instead of contributing to the city and banding together with Black people to fight a vampirical capitalist system, whites built houses with similar architecture to their former urban homes in the suburbs. But these seeming havens of domesticity were actually fortresses of racism. The parents in A Nightmare on Elm Street hide their crimes from their children, and by doing so condemn the young to a waking nightmare. Likewise, we can imagine the invisible parents in It Follows have galvanized the chain of deaths that hunts their children, and now they can only look helplessly on while their young are devoured by an evil that sometimes takes the shape of parents themselves. This return of the repressed becomes more evident as the characters transgress the boundary between suburb and city, and we see continuity rather than contrast between the two spheres. After Jay's gang realize that she's being followed by a supernatural entity, they set out to find Hugh, who might have more information on how to fight it. This is the first time we see the city. The camera lingers on the empty streets, burnt out abandoned graffitied warehouses and homes, and overgrown shrubbery. They go to Hugh's house, which turns out to be a squat he has been staying in order to pass it along while remaining anonymous. The squat is notable for its similarity to Jay's house. It looks like a future vision of Jay and her friend's world, a large, filthy, empty husk of middle-class life. These encounters with the futureless future galvanize Jay and her gang to fight. But by playing by its rules, they become complicitous in the chain of cruelty that characterizes the late capitalist city. At first, they simply drive from place to place, trying to use big, gas-guzzling cars to avoid their doom. When Jay realizes she can't outrun this relentless force by simply burning a hole in the ozone layer, she passes the curse along more directly, sleeping with boys and men who we know will be hunted themselves. Feigning innocence, she passes it on to her friend Greg, hoping that he can take care of himself. But even though he too passes it along, it comes back to him, taking the shape of his mother and murdering him in the course of a sexual assault. As Sion Nagai notes, the sexual transmission of the curse in It Follows is a circulation of deferrals. In the logic that the characters are presented with, they must pass on their curse to the most vulnerable and abjected person they can find. An economically unproductive, figuratively kinless person, in order to protect themselves and their families from the disastrous and inevitable endpoint of a social structure built on debt and exploitation. By keeping the chain of murder in play, Jay is playing by the rules set out for young people who are told they live in a dog-eat-dog meritocracy and that there is no way out but to participate in individualized systemic violence. However, the utopian kernel of this futureless future is potential solidarity. Jay, Kelly, Paul, Yara, and Greg are not completely isolated. In the course of fighting it, they become a tight-knit group. Together, they surround Jay with their care. As a kind of brat pack, the gang seem to embody a typical coming-of-age narrative in which a group of young friends journey from innocence to experience. But the experience is not just futurelessness and hopelessness. It is also recognition that youthful friendship may blossom into collective rebellion. As youths become more and more marginalized in late capitalism, this also gives them a kind of power. Their aimlessness and lack of stakes in the capitalist system gives them space and time to build alternate forms of sociality and struggle, as we saw in the Occupy and Black Lives Matter movements. If Jay and Kelly's mother represents the hyper-exploitation of feminized workers, who are spread so tautly across all of their responsibilities that they are rendered invisible, Jay's group of supportive adolescent friends, not yet fully inserted into the system, symbolize the latent potential in these feminized formations. We see this when the group changes tactics in their struggle against it. Instead of the individualized solution of sleeping with people and passing the curse along, they band together and come up with a jerry-rigged battle plan that entails luring it into the water in order to electrify it with TVs, irons, and lamps. The use of domestic appliances is a kind of recovery project, reclaiming the tools of social reproduction to fight rather than comply with the forces that assault these youths. In this final battle, it takes on the shape of Jay and Kelly's dead father, and perhaps by fighting him, they are directly facing the complicity of their parents in a system that leads to general ruin and lack of solidarity. Rather than pass along the curse, they explode it as they shoot it in the head and its blood seeps out, mingling with the pool's water. With this explosive collective victory, the group appears to have a future, but for how long, we don't know. The battle against it will rage on so long as the structural terrors that youth face remain. Even if the ending is ambiguous, it still redeems the many instances of care we have seen between the teens who have slept, eaten, and traveled together, and participated in communal mutual aid to protect Jay from it, and more importantly, believed her story that it is real and that she's not insane. This recognition of and struggle against an enemy that cannot be explained away by psychology or individual failure points to an acknowledgement of the real ghosts that haunt youth, the neglect of social reproduction, structural racism, and economic violence. All right, and then I'm just going to transition into the last film I'm going to talk about, Assassination Nation. In the year 2021, the witch hunt is alive and well, and as in the 17th century Salem, women and young girls are disproportionately targeted. In our moment, images of 6- and 7-year-olds handcuffed in their schoolyards flicker on our screens. Cops drag 12-year-old Black girls accused of not giving up their cell phones across their classroom floors. Even in their homes, social media bullies hound young girls, leading many to contemplate suicide. Adding to these horrors are this year's onslaught of anti-trans bills that seem intent on crushing trans youth's lives before they have even properly started. There are at least 35 bills that have been introduced into state legislators that would block trans kids from getting gender-affirming medical care. And 69 proposed bills would shut trans youth out of sports activities. These official sanctions against trans kids don't even scrape the surface of daily life, where they are more likely to experience sexual violence, bullying, and mental health issues, with more than 1/3 of transgender high school students attempting suicide per year. Even before trans kids enter the work world, where, as Michelle O'Brien argues, the vast majority of them will experience discrimination, they are made to feel the depths of futurelessness in humiliation such as not having access to bathrooms or locker rooms. Even in the supposedly safe haven of the family, there is no real security, as half of trans youths report they have been directly mocked by their family. Unsurprisingly, 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. The 2018 film Assassination Nation asked the question, why does this society want to kill its young girls? This revisioning of the Salem witch trials begins in a seemingly calm suburb, but as the camera slowly cruises past anonymous tract homes and well-maintained lawns, we see that all is not as it appears. An ominous mood pervades the scene as residents turn toward the camera, displaying menacing, filmy masks. In a voiceover, 18-year-old Lily Colson explains that her entire town has lost their minds and are now set on killing 4 teenage girls. Before she tells the story of how this came about, though, she provides the audience with a series of trigger warnings for bullying, abuse, toxic masculinity, homophobia, transphobia, guns, nationalism, racism, the male gaze, rape, sexism, and fragile male egos. Assassination Nation's opening montage of trigger warnings lets us know that the girls in this film are not simply victims. They are self-aware, third-wave feminists who have the language to describe their patriarchal, abusive world. When they call out boys for objectifying them or refusing to give them pleasure, they are not, as Bex proclaims, bitches. They are feminists. However, knowing the language of feminism cannot free them from the violence of a patriarchal world. Contrary to a postmodern hope that discourse alone can change the material conditions of society, Lily and her friends must reckon with threats of violence that go beyond language. The murderous violence of this society is foreordained. There is no mystery. Having established that the girls will be hunted down by their neighbors, Lily then takes us back 2 weeks to the beginning of the story. Back then, the young women were not so immediately threatened, but they still spent their days and nights navigating the perils of teen sexuality, where social media compels them to perform for the male gaze, and the threat of bullying always looms. The girls dress to exhibit their freedom, but are constantly censored by a society riddled with confusing rules. Unsurprisingly, Lily and her friends rely on social media for their sense of self. But while they hope to access some sense of autonomy, the toxic sphere of cybersociality turns their lives into an endless mindfuck. Much of the film shows that the community of Salem has no public life of its own. Instead, the good people of Salem are constantly absorbed in the spectacle of the internet. The teenagers go to parties and take drugs, but rather than be present for their hedonistic pursuits, they capture their lives for social media. Life then is a kind of prison, but not only are youth incarcerated in their own images as they mediate every experience through social media, but they are unknowingly involved in a kind of labor that generates profit for capitalism, even as it produces endless insecurity for themselves. In 2014, activist artist Laurel Patak created a public manifesto to counter the exploitation inherent in social media. Her call to arms was the screed, "Wages for Facebook." In it, she proclaimed that what we now call friendship has become unwaged work. She says, "With every like, chat, tag, or poke, our subjectivity turns them a profit. They call it sharing, we call it stealing. We've been bound by their terms of service far too long. It's time for our terms." Demanding wages for participation in social media for Patak was a way to demystify the fantasy that Facebook is simply a fun way to stay in touch with friends. Instead, it is a mode of control. Demanding wages for participation makes visible, quote, that our options, our opinions, and emotions have all been distorted for a specific function online, and then have been thrown back at us as a model to which we should all conform if we want to be accepted in this society. A tool of conformity and profit, Facebook and other forms of social media efficiently create a society that is vulnerable and serviceable to the demands of capitalism. For young girls, the whole process of coming of age is monetized and commodified. This goes beyond purchasing the right clothes and makeup, dieting to the right weight, and listening to the right music. This consumer lifestyle must all be naturalized, made to seem effortless and authentic. This conformity and claustrophobia are the true horrors of Assassination Nation, even before the girls are faced with an entire community that wants to kill them. It is no accident that the Wages for Facebook manifesto was crafted in the spirit of the feminist Wages for Housework campaign of the 1970s. By creating this homage to a long-forgotten feminist movement, Patak is arguing that participating in internet sociality is a lot like housework. Both activities are central to the reproduction of daily life, and yet they are not acknowledged as work. Instead, they are evidence that in order to reproduce itself, our society requires unwaged performances of love, emotional labor, and naturalized friendship. As we see from the internet's focus on female bodies, this work is also feminized and sexualized. As Nicole Veneto notes, the agency allotted to women in the digital sphere is largely dependent on their conformity to sexual constructions of heterosexualized femininity, demanding they be sexy but not slutty, demure but not prudish. In 1974, Silvia Federici wrote an essay titled "Wages Against Housework." This began with a manifesto-like pronouncement, "They say it is love, we say it is unwaged work. They call it frigidity, we call it absenteeism." Here she's writing about the duties of the housewife, but she just as well could be talking about the emotional labor the teens of Assassination Nation must devote to internet sociality. She goes on to suggest that when smiles become a way that capitalism reproduces itself, the greatest weapon of the feminized worker is to refuse, quote, destroying the healing virtues of a smile. Likewise, Patak's Wages for Facebook manifesto seeks to destroy the fantasy that smiles and likes are always voluntary and healing. Instead, the demand for these gestures of affirmation and care can become a form of servitude. Social media participation keeps us connected, but at what cost? Behind this connection is a threat. If we disconnect, we will be unloved. Or, as Lily puts it, the truth is, no one wants the real you, so you stop telling the truth. Lily, Bex, Em, and Sarah do use the internet to amplify their own feminist voices, but they are drowned out by a world of toxic masculinity. Their boyfriends and potential boyfriends have been inundated by porn before they ever had a real sexual experience, which teaches them little about female pleasure and much about the ways women should look, act, and respond. At a party, the girls express exasperation as the boys boast about the sexual skills they have learned from porn, knowing that this will lead to future pain and humiliation. Bex, the one trans girl of the group, is the most vulnerable to the toxic masculinity that infuses all the girls' lives. She forms a mutual attraction with Diamond, a hunky football player, but the constant threat of transphobic violence keeps her from enjoying the thrill of new love. Diamond's overtures to Bex are made through late-night texts, allowing him to maintain a double life where he never interacts with her in front of his peers. When they finally have sex at a school party, he is gentle and seductive, but afterwards he emphasizes that their relationship must be kept secret, signifying his shame at his own desires and driving Bex to tears. In this and other scenes, director Sam Levinson uses split screens to show how isolated and mediated the teens are, even when they sit side by side. The everyday horrors the girls face are made less nightmarish by their close friendship and their adept ability to navigate their internet-saturated world. But when a hacker exposes the personal data of half the town of Salem, the girls are overwhelmed by the violent forces around them. The placid facade of Salem drops dramatically as a homophobic family values politician, quote unquote, is exposed as a cross-dresser, and the high school's black principal is pilloried by an angry white mob because he had innocent nude photos of his daughter on his phone. The town's moral panic draws closer to the teens when Lily's older lover, who exchanges sex with her as daddy, is exposed by the hacker. Even though she hid her face when sending him sex, her insecure boyfriend figures out that she is a slut appearing in hundreds of daddy's nude photos, and after attacking her in the halls of their high school, he uses the internet to dox and condemn her by spreading word that she is the town whore. After discovering Lily's affair with Daddy, her parents kick her out of the house, and she's chased down the street by would-be rapists who now think of her as Salem's own little porn star, and therefore fair game. Lily and her friends barricade themselves in Em and Sarah's house with their single mother, Nance, who has proved herself to be the one feminist benign parental figure in Salem. Huddling together, they watch a Japanese Tsukubon or girl boss film that features 4 tough-looking women who are gearing up for a battle. The young women dress in the same matching red raincoats as the women on the screen, signifying the beginning of their transformation into warriors. But they are caught off guard by the vengeful men of Salem, who invade the house and attack the women mercilessly, killing Nance. Lily escapes, and with nowhere to go, she makes her way to Daddy's house, realizing too late that he is worse than the vigilantes she is fleeing. Under the guise of protecting Lily, he places her in his young daughter's room and soon tries to rape her. By feigning desire for him, she manages to escape to his bathroom, but when she finds his slain wife and daughter in the bathtub. At this point, we see her commit to her new identity as a warrior and ready herself for battle. Etching a razor into a bar of soap, she opens the door and lunges at her attacker, slitting Daddy's throat, who bleeds out on top of her. Newly baptized in blood, Lily discovers Daddy's arsenal, revealing that for him, as for most of the town of Salem, suburban normality had been a mere chrysalis stage that preceded the emergence of monstrous white supremacist MAGA/MRA butterflies. Looking back, we have seen the signs of this metamorphosis. In an opening shot, a kid on a big wheel bike, the perpetual sign of suburban innocence, turns to the camera only to reveal a face covered in an intimidating American flag mask. And throughout the film, the girls have had to navigate rapey boys and men who shove fingers down their throats, leer at them, call them sluts, and boast of their porn watching. Even before the whole town loses their minds, Lily's boyfriend, Mark, treats her horribly. Realizing that she has told her friends that he refuses to go down on her, he lashes out, calling her a whore who should have some fucking self-respect. Then, when Lily's nude pictures emerge, she becomes excited at having an excuse to abuse and humiliate her, asking, "Is it wrong that I'm actually enjoying this?" For the good people of Salem, as their cop/leader calls them in a callback to 17th century Puritan culture, the destruction of young girls is a way to fight their own humiliation and emasculation. And for that reason, they conflate whores and terrorists, vowing to uproot both and take Salem back. Predictably, the football players, now dubbed the Salem High Gang, decide to culminate their misogynist mob violence with a transphobic lynching. They capture Bex and tie her to the back of a pickup truck in a crucifix position. This image of Bex as the true martyr of Assassination Nation attests to the centrality of trans struggle to a moment of gender depression. Hari Neff, the trans actress who plays Bex, notes that being a young trans girl is structured by the impulse to find love while trying not to die. This desire and fear is relevant to all the girls in Assassination Nation, but Bex faces deeper challenges and stigma, and because of this, represents a more radical critique of the system they face. When the homophobic mayor of Salem reveals himself to be a cross-dresser and has his life destroyed for it, Lily feels some sympathy for him, whereas Bex is intransigently angry. She says, "Because people like me kill ourselves every day, he wouldn't mourn my death, so why the fuck should I mourn his?" Here and in other scenes, Bex is consistently the most vocal and radical of the four girls in her critiques of rape culture, porn culture, and other injustices. This supports Juliana Gleason's claim that trans people have become central to contemporary radical social movements, not only for trans rights, but in movements against police violence, environmental destruction, poverty, and austerity. The harsh conditions that transgender people endure, she argues, leads to a radical vision. As Alan Sears claims, we can't understand gender and sexuality apart from the social reproduction, which means that we can't have real sexual liberation without addressing the ways our bodies and our lives are enmeshed in relations of work, household, and the market. The trans experience of the family and everyday life sharpens the perception that structural transformation is necessary. As Gleason puts it, our conditions are beyond redemption. Alienation from the heteronormative family orients trans activists against conservative forces. And even as trans people are targeted for their unproductive desires and faced with unrelenting disciplinary violence, this only increases the urgency to fight back. As martyr and hero of Assassination Nation, Bex never capitulates to this violence, instead asserting by her actions and existence the utopian demand that new forms of sociality and collectivity spring up in place of the horrific, hypocritical death drive of Salem's, quote, family values. As the violence against them mounts, Bex and her friends undergo their own transformation, their coming of rage. The now heavily armed Lily stops the cop car that carries Sarah and Em to the station, and when the officer who's been riling up Salem's lynch mob challenges her by taunting, "Little girl, what you gonna do? Are you gonna shoot a cop? You aren't allowed to shoot a cop." Lily cocks her gun and just says that, killing the cop dead. Now armed, the group goes on to liberate Bex, and together they all face off against the lynch mob, strafing their pickup truck with bullets. The girls become a militant battle unit, and this is where many reviewers lose faith in the movie, claiming that it glorifies violence. A number of reviews echo Maddie Oatman's more general critique of rape revenge plots. She claims that by ending with retributive violence, these narratives, quote, replicate the same power structure the Avenger wishes to hold accountable. I disagree with this view. When a structurally victimized group gathers together to fight back, their use of force should not be equated with state, racist, or sexist violence. Historically, every gain made by oppressed people against their oppressors involves some kind of struggle, and some of these struggles were armed, militant, or violent. Clearly, the violent institution of slavery can't be equated to the violence of a slave revolt. And yet, critics feel perfectly comfortable suggesting that a woman striking back at her rapist has somehow become the same violent type as her assaulter. One of the most insidious tricks of capitalist realism is to equate revolution, self-defense, and underclass rioting, the fight for a better world, with the systematic violence that destroys our dreams, our communities, and our environment. In the final moments of Assassination Nation, the young girls of Salem rise up in the name of freedom and autonomy against gangs of men who wave the flag of misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and general repression. With this battle, it seems the future is not so futureless after all. One's coming of age is seen as a collective transformation rather than an individualist dead end. So it's kind of I don't really have a conclusion. I was just kind of reading these sections, but I love to kind of chat with people about how we conclude or how we put together all these ideas. The book is still in a draft form, so I really treasure your feedback on the talk. Thank you so much.